One second I was standing under the hard white glow of the chandeliers in the Admiral's Row Club, with polished brass railings gleaming behind the bar and the smell of butter, sherry, and old money hanging in the air. And the next I had a bowl of she-crab soup sliding down the front of my cream silk blouse while a 6-foot thug in a navy blazer held the empty porcelain dish in both hands like he'd just completed a ceremony. Gasps cracked through the room. A spoon skittered across a linen-covered table. Gage Holloway leaned toward me, steam still rising off my clothes, and said loud enough for the donors, the officers, and the contractors clustered under the fluorescent spill from the buffet lights to hear. That's what happens when a thief reaches into family accounts. My husband Adrian Pike didn't come to me first. He went to my father. Daniel Mercer, my younger brother, took one step sideways and lifted a manila folder against his chest like a prosecutor preparing an exhibit. My stepmother Vivian pressed a ringed hand to her collarbone and widened her eyes for the room, not for me. And my father, Thomas Mercer, with his silver cuff links and his bourbon glass and his posture still straight as a mast even at 62, looked at my ruined blouse, then at the circle of staring faces around us, and said the one thing that told me exactly who he had decided to protect. "Caroline," he said quietly, jaw tight, "stay quiet. My name is Caroline Mercer. I'm 31. And this is the story of how I let my family believe I would swallow their humiliation, right up until the United States Navy called my name and tore their little empire open from the inside." The soup clung to me in thick orange streaks. It dripped from the hem of my blazer onto the dark carpet in slow, obscene drops. I could feel the burn on my skin, but what I remember most clearly was the cold in the room afterward. Not the temperature. The social cold. That stiff, breathless pause that settles over a crowd when people realize they're watching someone get publicly sacrificed and are deciding in real time whether to intervene or pretend it's justified. No one moved. The string quartet in the corner had stopped mid-phrase. A waiter holding a silver tray of champagne flutes froze near the carved mahogany doors as if crossing the room might turn him into a witness. Gage rolled his shoulders back and set the bowl down on the nearest cocktail table with theatrical care. He had the heavy hands and flattened nose of a man who'd spent a lot of years making other people flinch for a living. My brother liked to call him head of operations. Everyone else in Norfolk who knew anything called him what he was: muscle in a tailored jacket. Daniel opened the folder and snapped a few papers against his palm. "She accessed restricted ledgers," he announced, his voice sharp, eager, almost bright. "Transferred internal files. We have timestamps." I looked at the papers from where I stood, soup soaking into silk, and noticed the first thing Daniel hadn't expected me to notice. The header font was wrong. That almost made me smile. Adrian finally turned toward me. His tie was still perfect, his dark hair smoothed back, his expression arranged in that careful mask he used in court and in bed when he wanted to hide what he'd already decided. He touched my father's elbow, then stepped half a pace toward me. "Caroline," he said in the patient, legal tone he used when he was trying to make cruelty sound reasonable, "don't make this worse." There was a wet strand of hair stuck to my cheek. I brushed it back with 2 fingers and looked at him until his eyes flickered away. "Worse for who?" I asked. The question landed harder than if I'd shouted. Gage gave a short laugh. "Still performing, huh?" Vivian found her voice first. "Of course she did. Can we please not do this here?" she said, but she said it to me, not to the man who had just poured near-boiling soup down the front of my clothes. "There are officers in the room." My father took a slow sip of bourbon, buying himself half a second, then lowered the glass. "You have embarrassed this family enough." That was the line. Not "are you hurt?" Not "did he burn you?" Not "Daniel, what have you done?" Just that. Around us, the guests had begun to shift. Some were turning away with the brittle relief of people grateful the humiliation didn't belong to them. Others stayed fixed where they were, drawn in despite themselves. At the back of the room, under the gold-lettered donor board for the Tidewater Naval Heritage Foundation, I saw Commander Evelyn Price standing very still beside a man in a dark suit I recognized as NCS Special Agent Malcolm Reed. Neither of them intervened. Neither of them looked surprised. Good. So they had seen everything. Daniel slid one of the pages free and held it up. "You think you're smarter than everyone in this room," he said. "You think because you handled compliance you can bury whatever you want. You stole records and routed a transfer through a shell vendor." The fluorescent light caught the paper in his hand. I could see the skew in the margins from across the room. A rushed print job. Probably done less than an hour ago. He should have left me more time to respect the effort. I took a linen napkin from the nearest table and dabbed once at my wrist. The burn stung sharply now, but pain can be clarifying. It cut through the theater of it. The lies. The arrangement. 3 months earlier I had still believed that blood made people pause before destroying you. That illusion had started cracking on a Tuesday in late March when I found a mismatch in a shipping certification file for pressure-regulating valves bound for maintenance work at Norfolk Naval Shipyard. Mercer Maritime Systems had built its name on emergency marine supply, precision replacement components, and the kind of patriotic branding that made our brochures look like recruitment posters. My father loved to say we didn't just serve contracts. We served the fleet. He said it at charity luncheons, on local business panels, at church. He said it enough that people mistook repetition for character. I was director of compliance by then. Not because anyone in my family thought I deserved authority, but because I had a law degree and accounting background, and an inconvenient habit of reading every line before I signed. I had spent 4 years cleaning up sloppy vendor records, tightening audit trails, and making our company look more disciplined than it really was. I was useful in the way lockboxes are useful. You don't admire them. You just expect them. The mismatch had been small. A lot number on a metallurgy certificate that didn't match the lot number on the receiving log. Most people would have missed it. Daniel definitely had. He thought operational fraud was about swagger, about moving fast and bullying slower people into silence. He never understood that fraud is usually undone by formatting, by repetition, by people who grow lazy around details. I checked the certificate archive. Then the vendor invoice. Then the internal warehouse scan log. By midnight I had found 6 more inconsistencies. By dawn I had found 23. Rejected surplus valves had been relabeled, recertified, and pushed through under federal maintenance contracts. Inspection photos had been altered. Supporting documentation had been backdated. Payments had been routed through a pass-through vendor called Black Channel Logistics, which had a mailbox address, a registered agent in Delaware, and no employees. When I confronted Adrian first, I still thought I was speaking to my husband. We were in our kitchen on Bausch Street then, the one with the pale quartz island and the pendant lights he insisted made the room look editorial. Rain was ticking against the windows. I laid 3 printouts on the counter between us and watched his face. He didn't react to the fraud. He reacted to the fact that I had copies. That's when I knew. He had rested one hand on the back of a stool, very still, his wedding band catching the under-cabinet light, and said, "Caroline, before you do anything impulsive, you need to understand there are context issues." Context issues. I remember actually laughing. Just once. Counterfeit certification records are not a context issue. They're not counterfeit, he said too quickly. They're recertified assets. Through a shell company. That doesn't mean what you think it means. No, I said, looking at him. It means exactly what I think it means. His jaw had set then. Not guilty. Annoyed. Like I was creating paperwork for him. Talk to your father before you escalate. And there was. Not our father. Your father. In that instant he wasn't my husband standing in our kitchen. He was my father's lawyer with access to my bed. The affair came later. The proof of it, I mean. I found that a week after. Not because I was looking for lipstick on collars like some tragic woman in a made-for-TV divorce, but because Adrian had grown careless with synced devices. Hotel confirmations. Calendar blocks labeled donor development. A receipt from the Glass Lantern in Ghent for 2 people on a night he told me he was in Richmond meeting outside council. The woman was Celine Ward, Mercer Maritime's communications director, all polished shoulders and strategic concern. The sort of woman who never entered a room so much as arranged its attention around her. I didn't confront that. Not yet. By then I had understood the first rule of surviving a coordinated betrayal. When people are building a case against you, outrage is evidence for them. Silence is evidence for you. So I said less. I archived more. I set up mirrored backups off-site. I photographed warehouse pallets. I copied contract amendments. I sent myself harmless-looking spreadsheets that contained embedded metadata. I started carrying a second phone. I met with Lena Ortiz, a maritime fraud attorney with a small office above a coffee shop on Granby Street and a reputation for dismantling men who mistook volume for credibility. Lena wore charcoal suits, low heels, and reading glasses on a silver chain. She asked few questions the first time we met. She just listened, hands folded, then said, "If you're right, this isn't just corporate theft. This is federal exposure tied to military procurement. If you take a shot, you don't get to miss." "I'm not planning to miss," I told her. That was 6 weeks before the gala. Then Daniel started smiling at me more. That's the thing about people who think they're hunting you. They always begin to enjoy themselves too early. He'd linger in my doorway with a coffee he never drank. He'd ask if I was sleeping. He'd drop comments about loyalty in front of staff. Gage started appearing in the warehouse more often, hovering near loading docks with his thick forearms crossed over his chest, talking to foremen in low tones that always seemed to end when I entered. My father, meanwhile, got softer. That was worse. He invited me to Sunday dinners again. Asked about my workload. Touched my shoulder in front of other people. Let Vivian ask if Adrian and I had thought about children. It was the performance of family as a velvet trap. He had decided something. I just didn't know the date yet. Then Nora Hensley called me. At the time, Nora was Daniel's girlfriend in the casual, polished way powerful men describe women they use for access. She was a Navy lieutenant assigned to quality assurance at the Mid-Atlantic Regional Maintenance Center. Smart. Controlled. Blonde hair usually pinned so precisely it seemed engineered. I'd met her twice at company events. She had the cautious eyes of someone who had learned early to think before she spoke. She called from a blocked number at 10:17 on a Thursday night. "I think Daniel has been using terminology from my briefings in your internal meetings," she said without introduction. "And I think he knows which lots are scheduled for spot review before anyone outside the command should know that." I stayed quiet. Nora exhaled once. "If I'm wrong, hang up." "I'm listening." There was a pause, then she said, "I saw a shipping packet in his car last weekend. Lot numbers didn't match the maintenance bulletin. He told me not to worry about it. Then he asked whether one of the destroyers had already installed the replacements. He acted like he was making conversation. He wasn't. The silence between us then was the kind that has weight. Once you hear a certain kind of truth, there is a moral cost to pretending you didn't. "Why are you calling me?" I asked. "Because I looked into you before I did. And everything I found said you were the only person in that building who still reads what she signs. That was the beginning. Nora didn't hand me secrets she wasn't allowed to share. She was too disciplined for that. What she did do was tell me where to look, which maintenance schedules mattered, which unit had reported a pressure irregularity 3 weeks earlier, and which phrases in the contract amendments should have raised alarms. She also told me something else. Daniel was planning a public move. "He thinks if he embarrasses you first," she said, "you'll spend your energy defending yourself instead of exposing him." I leaned back in my office chair and watched the city lights beyond the window smear across the glass. "Good," I said. She was quiet for a beat. "That doesn't sound like fear." "It isn't." We started building from there. Lena brought in Commander Evelyn Price through the Navy's Procurement Integrity Office. Price, a JAG officer with a voice as even as a level and a habit of looking at liars until they started volunteering details nobody asked for, reviewed the documentation chain. NCIS took over the criminal exposure side once the altered certification trail and shell payments aligned. I kept working. Kept smiling. Kept attending meetings. I let Adrian keep believing he was reading me accurately. He was not. He mistook my calm for shock. My distance for heartbreak. My patience for weakness. That was his professional failure as much as his marital one. He had spent years around frightened clients and bluffing executives and had started to think all silence was surrender. It wasn't. Sometimes silence is just someone loading the evidence correctly. Back in the Admiral's Row Club, the room had started breathing again. Small whispers. Fabric rustling. A chair scraping somewhere near the auction table. My skin still burned. Cream silk had turned rust orange and translucent in places, clinging at my waist. I could smell crab, pepper, sherry, and the metallic bite of my own anger. Daniel took my lack of panic as encouragement. "She's been unstable for months," he said. "We tried to handle this privately." There was a tiny movement near the back of the room. Commander Price folding her hands. Unstable. That was new. Not unexpected. Just finally spoken aloud. Vivian stepped closer, careful not to touch me. "Caroline, sweetheart, go upstairs. Clean yourself up. We'll sort this out." "Will you?" I asked. Her face tightened. Adrian moved in then, lowering his voice. Please don't do this. I'm not doing anything. You know what I mean. I do, I said. That's why I'm not taking your advice. Gage snorted and looked around for approval. This is over. She got caught. I turned my head and looked at him fully for the first time since the soup hit me. He had a smear of orange on his thumb. He noticed me noticing it and tucked his hand behind his back. That almost made me pity him. Almost. I set the damp napkin down on the table beside the empty bowl. Then I reached into my bag, took out my phone, unlocked it and held it up where Daniel could see the screen. Before you say anything else, I said calmly, you should know the ballroom cameras captured the last 4 minutes from 3 angles. His mouth twitched. I continued. Including you handing Gage the bowl after you pointed to me. Gage's expression changed first. Not fear. Calculation. That proves nothing, Daniel snapped. No, I said. It proves you planned the spectacle. I tapped once and turned the phone toward my father instead. On the screen was a frozen frame from a warehouse camera dated 11 days earlier. Daniel stood beside a pallet of relabeled valve assemblies. Gage was cutting old tags from crates with a utility knife. The timestamp sat in the corner in quiet white numbers. For the first time that evening my father's color shifted. Adrian saw it too. Where did you get that? He demanded. From the same archive you told IT to wipe, I said. The room tightened around us. I swiped to the next image. An invoice chain. The Black Channel Logistics pass-through. Then the next. A close-up of a metallurgy certificate with editing residue visible in the metadata trail. Then the next. A screenshot of an internal access log showing my credentials disabled on May 14th, 19 days before the transfer Daniel was accusing me of initiating. I did not rush. That was the most important part. Around me everyone else had frantic energy now. Daniel's breathing was too fast. Adrian's hand kept flattening and refolding against his thigh. Vivian's nails were digging crescents into her clutch. Gage kept shifting his weight heel to heel as if the floor had become unreliable. I simply scrolled. The transfer you're holding up, I said, glancing at Daniel's papers, uses a deprecated template header we stopped using in January. The margins are wrong. The account number belongs to a training database, not a live vendor ledger. And the export timestamp is from 7:42 p.m. tonight. Daniel looked at the page, then at me. Someone at the back of the room inhaled sharply. I let the silence settle over them. Then I added, so either you forged it quickly or someone forged it quickly for you. You're insane, Daniel said, but the force had gone out of it. Actually, I replied evenly, you've been falsifying Navy certification records and laundering payments through a shell vendor tied to federal maintenance contracts. Nobody spoke. The silence that followed was absolute. Not social silence. Impact silence. The kind that lands in a room like a dropped sheet of steel. My father set his bourbon down too carefully. Caroline. Don't, I said. He stared at me, and in that stare I saw the moment he understood 2 things at once. First, that I was not improvising, and second, that I had already taken this somewhere beyond family. Adrian swallowed. Who else has seen this? I looked past him. Commander Evelyn Price stepped forward then, her white uniform immaculate against the dark wood paneling and brass fixtures of the club. Malcolm Reed moved with her, suit plain, badge still pocketed. The crowd parted before either of them touched anyone. Authority has its own atmosphere. It thins rooms. Price stopped at my shoulder. Ms. Mercer, she said as if we were simply continuing an appointment, we're ready for you upstairs. There was the Navy calling my name. A visible shudder passed through Vivian. Daniel's face went blank in that peculiar way people's faces do when their internal script tears and they have nothing ready to replace it. Gage looked at Malcolm Reed, recognized what he was looking at, and took half a step back. My father found his voice. Commander, this is a family misunderstanding. Price didn't even look at him. It is not. Daniel tried again, louder. You can't just walk in here and... Malcolm Reed took out his badge. I can actually... I picked up my bag. Soup still clung damp and cooling against my skin. The burn would leave a mottled patch on my collarbone for a week. I remember noticing that with surprising detachment. Then I turned to my father. He was still trying to hold the room together by posture alone. Shoulders squared. Chin lifted. The old Thomas Mercer performance. The patriotic businessman. The benefactor. The father whose voice always ended discussions when I was a girl. He had told me to stay quiet. So I smiled just slightly and said, I am. Then I walked past him. As I reached the door, I paused beside the cocktail table where Gage had set the bowl. Orange broth pooled in the curve of white porcelain under the chandelier light. I looked at the stain, then at him. Keep the bowl, I said softly. It's evidence now. Upstairs, the private conference salon looked out over the Elizabeth River through tall windows streaked with the last blue light of evening. The carpet was navy with a gold border. The chairs were upholstered in cream leather. A tray of untouched water glasses stood on a sideboard beside silver carafes and a plate of lemon wedges no one had asked for. The room smelled faintly of polish and coffee and rain coming off the water. Price handed me a folder. Inside was a preservation order, a witness intake packet, and a summary memo with my own documentation timeline attached as Exhibit A. I sat down slowly, peeled the ruined blazer off my shoulders and laid it over the back of the chair. My blouse stuck for a second where the soup had dried in patches. Malcolm set a burn kit on the table. Thanked him. He nodded once. Price watched me open the small packet of burn gel. Are you able to proceed? Yes. She tilted her head slightly. You seem remarkably unsurprised by what happened downstairs. I was expecting something public, I said. Daniel likes theater. Gage likes touch. Adrian prefers documents he thinks sound official. They combine styles. A flicker of what might have been approval crossed her face. You were right. I usually am when men get sloppy. Malcolm actually smiled at that. We got to work. I gave my statement first. Not emotional. Not embellished. Time, sequence, names, the content of what was said, where Price and Reed had been standing, who witnessed the assault, how long between Daniel's accusation and my evidence response. Precision matters when other people are already trying to write your motives for you. Then Price opened a secure tablet and began walking me through the next stage. NCIS had enough to secure devices, freeze document destruction, and compel cooperation on the federal procurement side through interagency review. But for the deeper civil and contractual dismantling, for the company control issues, the asset shielding, the marital and fiduciary entanglements, we needed the formal confrontation on paper. 2 days, Price said. Your counsel has arranged a joint evidentiary session. Voluntary attendance has been encouraged. If they refuse, this becomes slower and uglier for them. They'll come, I said. Why? Because my father still believes he can manage outcomes in rooms with polished tables. Price closed the tablet. Then let's give him a room. The next 48 hours were very quiet on the surface and very loud underneath. Mercer Maritime Systems sent an internal memo calling the gala incident an unfortunate interpersonal disagreement. By midnight, 3 local blogs had posted blurry photos of me standing in soup-stained silk while Gage loomed over me. By dawn, one of the blogs had quietly taken its post down after Lena Ortiz sent a letter sharp enough to leave cuts through email. My phone lit up relentlessly. Vivian, call me immediately. Daniel, you have no idea what you've done. Adrian, we need to handle this privately before it becomes irreversible. Unknown number, probably Gage. Delete everything. My father waited almost 6 hours before texting. That was deliberate. He liked to imply control through restraint. Come home. We'll discuss as a family. I archived it. Then another came. You are hurting people who have protected you your entire life. Archived that too. Adrian escalated faster than the others. He moved from soft persuasion to legal threat to marital nostalgia in less than one afternoon, which was how I knew he was frightened. He called me from 3 different numbers. Left 2 voicemails. The first was clipped and professional. Caroline, you are making assumptions based on incomplete data. I strongly advise you to stop communicating with outside parties until we've had counsel review your materials. The second was lower, almost intimate, like he was trying to reach backward through time and pull me into an older version of us. Caroline, please. Don't do this through strangers. Just talk to me. I deleted neither. Documentation is sometimes just patience with storage. Lena had me move into the Seaport Regent Hotel for 2 nights under a corporate booking. Neutral ground. Secure access. Room 1412. Harbor view. Gray drapes, brushed steel lamps. one abstract painting over the bed that looked like a storm trying very hard to be tasteful. I stood at the window that first night with a cold bottle of sparkling water pressed to the burn on my collarbone and watched tugboats move through the river like dark punctuation marks. At 9:13 p.m. Nora Hensley knocked on my door. She was in civilian clothes for once. Camel coat, black slacks, hair loose around her shoulders. She held a flat cardboard bakery box in one hand. "I brought apology cake," she said when I opened the door. "It's from Sugar House." It seemed more useful than flowers. I stepped aside to let her in. Apology for what? For dating an idiot adjacent to a crime. That made me laugh harder than anything had in weeks. She set the box on the desk and reached into her coat pocket. "Also for this." He handed me a flash drive. Inside were copies of Daniel's messages to her from the last 3 months. Not classified material. Nothing that compromised her obligations. Just the pieces he had sent because he liked sounding important. Photos from company dinners. A snapshot of a loading manifest on his passenger seat. A voice note complaining about some self-righteous audit queen standing in the way of margin recovery. Calendar screenshots. One message in particular made Lena lift her glasses and say, "Well, that's helpful." It was from Daniel, sent 3 weeks earlier. "Once we smear Caroline, Dad can move her out clean. Adrian says he can make it look like she panicked and copied files." Nora saw my face as I read it and leaned against the edge of the desk, arms folded. "I should have called sooner." "You called in time." She looked at me for a moment, then said quietly, "For what it's worth, I don't think your father understands the difference between loyalty and silence." "No," I said. "He understands. He just prefers silence. It's cheaper." The morning of the confrontation, rain had washed Norfolk clean. Braddock and Weller occupied the top 2 floors of an old bank building on Main Street that had been restored into the sort of office men point to when they want clients to feel billed before they've even sat down. The elevator opened directly into a reception area lined with cream stone oil paintings of ships under sail, and bronze lamps that cast a warm amber light over everything. The conference room itself was all authority. Gleaming walnut table, deep leather chairs, glass water carafes, hidden screens recessed into paneled walls. Windows overlooking the harbor where gray water pressed flat under a low sky. I arrived with Lena and Commander Price 10 minutes early. I wore a slate blue suit, simple pearl studs and no wedding ring. That detail mattered to Adrian more than I expected. When he walked in and saw my bare left hand resting on a legal pad beside a neat stack of binders, the first crack in his expression wasn't fear. It was injury. As if betrayal counted differently when he suffered even a fraction of what he had arranged for me. He came in with my father, Daniel, Vivian, Gage, and 2 outside attorneys from Richmond whose shoes probably cost more than most people's rent. Daniel looked tired for the first time in his adult life. Gage had shaved too closely and nicked his jaw near the ear. Vivian wore ivory and diamonds and the brittle posture of a woman who had spent the drive over rehearsing indignation. My father looked almost unchanged, which only emphasized how much energy it must have taken him to produce that effect. Adrian's gaze snagged on the empty chair beside me, then on Price's uniform, then on the binders. "Who else is joining?" he asked. Lena smiled politely. "You'll see." The door opened again. NCIS Special Agent Malcolm Reed entered with a forensic auditor from the Defense Contract Audit Agency and a Navy contracting officer named Captain Arun Mehta, whose quiet manner gave the impression of someone who had spent a career learning how to separate excuses from numbers. Behind them came Nora Hensley. Daniel went still. He turned his head slowly as if his own neck resisted the fact of her presence. "Nora." She didn't answer. She took a seat across from him, set down a slim file and folded her hands. "That was the first fracture," Lena began. She did not dramatize. That was why she was devastating. She moved one exhibit at a time, voice steady, each point anchored to a date, a file type, a witness, a contract number. "On February 12th, she said, Mercer Maritime Systems received a pallet of rejected pressure-regulating valve assemblies from Chesapeake Salvage Industrial under a non-compliant secondary invoice. The goods were marked for scrap disposition. Instead, they were transferred internally to Warehouse Bay 4. She clicked the remote. A photo appeared on the recessed screen. Wooden pallets. Crates. Serial tags. On February 15, Mr. Daniel Mercer authorized relabeling through operations staff supervised by Mr. Holloway. Next slide. Gage cutting tags. Daniel checking a clipboard. On March 3, false recertification packets were created using certificate templates originally approved for a separate batch from Triton Valve Works. Metadata places the edits on a workstation assigned to Mr. Adrian Pike's office suite. Adrian leaned forward. That is a gross mischaracterization. Lena didn't look at him. You'll have a chance to speak. Next slide. Audit log. User paths. Time stamps. On April 6, Black Channel Logistics invoiced Mercer Maritime for expedited regional procurement support in the amount of $84,200. Black Channel has no employees, no storage capacity, and shares a registered agent with a trust attached to Mr. Thomas Mercer's family office. Vivian inhaled sharply. My father's right hand closed around his pen. On May 14, Lena continued, Ms. Caroline Mercer's system credentials were disabled from live vendor payment access. On June 2, documents later used to accuse Ms. Mercer of unauthorized transfer activity were generated using a training environment export template no longer valid in the live accounting system. Daniel's attorney finally broke in. You are drawing inferences from technical artifacts without foundation. Captain Mehta slid one sheet across the table. Foundation, he said mildly. The attorney stopped talking. Lena let that breathe, then moved to the timeline board displayed on the far wall. Dates connected by thin black lines. Contract IDs. Vendor names. Audit notices. A clean visual spine of their scheme. It made what they had done look exactly like what it was. Planned. Not messy. Not accidental. Premeditated. This next section matters, Lena said. Because isolated fraud can sometimes be argued as oversight. What cannot be argued here is lack of planning. She pointed with a silver pen. June 18. Internal email from Mr. Pike requesting a revision to standard destruction intervals for warehouse surveillance footage. Adrian spoke before he could stop himself. That was storage management. Malcolm Reed answered. We recovered the draft comments. One line reads, and I quote, clean up any unnecessary visual retention before the July spot review. Adrian's face drained. It was almost fascinating how blood can leave a person visibly like tide pulling off wet sand. Lena went on. July 1st. Mr. Holloway meets with Foreman Curtis Velez in Loading Bay 7. Mr. Velez later reports being told to stop reading labels and move boxes. Gage barked a laugh that sounded brittle. That guy's a drunk. The door opened again. Curtis Velez entered with a cup of bad coffee in one hand and a union rep in the other. He wore a plain work shirt and looked more solid than anyone in the room. No, Curtis said, taking the chair Malcolm indicated. I'm sober now, which is why I remember it so clearly. Second fracture. Daniel swiveled toward Gage. You said he wouldn't talk. Gage muttered. He wasn't supposed to. Nora turned her head slightly at that. Daniel saw it and looked away. Lena kept the tempo. Not fast. Relentless. August 9th. Ms. Hensley notices discrepancies between maintenance bulletins and lot references used by Mr. Daniel Mercer in private conversation. She later provides a statement regarding pre-audit knowledge patterns. Daniel stared at Nora. You went through my messages? I read my own phone, she said. He laughed once, disbelieving. You're helping her? I'm helping the sailors your shortcuts endangered. That hit him harder than anything Lena had said so far. Not because it was louder. Because it came from someone he had assumed belonged to him. Lena inclined her head slightly to Nora, then advanced to the next slide. September 9th. Ms. Mercer is informed through independent channels that a public discrediting effort is being discussed internally. September 17th at the Admiral's Row Club Gala, Ms. Mercer is falsely accused of theft using forged transfer records and physically assaulted on camera by Mr. Holloway in the presence of multiple witnesses, including federal personnel. Gage's attorney finally spoke. My client disputes the characterization of assault. Malcolm slid a tablet forward and tapped play. On screen, under the bright chandelier light of the ballroom, Daniel pointed. Gage lifted the bowl. Soup arced across the frame in a thick orange sheet and hit me full in the chest. The room recoiled. My father said, stay quiet. Nobody in the conference room moved. The only sound was the muted hiss from the tablet speaker and the soft hum of the air system above the walnut paneling. When the clip ended, Malcolm paused the frame on Gage's face. "Dispute whatever you like," he said. "The video is exceptionally clear." Vivian made a small sound in her throat. "Not grief. Social terror." My father straightened in his chair. "This has gotten far beyond what it needed to be." That was the first thing he said after 47 minutes of evidence. I turned and looked at him. "No," I said quietly. "It got exactly as far as you pushed it." He held my gaze and I saw the anger there finally, stripped of packaging. Not paternal. Proprietary. He was angry that I had refused my designated role. Angry that I had moved the conflict into a structure he didn't control. Angry that the daughter he had always treated as useful furniture had learned where the building's load-bearing walls actually were. Adrian tried one last pivot. "Even if there were irregularities, Caroline is hardly a neutral party. She's been emotional. Suspicious. We were in the middle of marital strain." Lena turned her head. "Is that your explanation for the hotel receipts with Celine Ward?" Adrian froze. I didn't even blink. Lena reached into a side folder and withdrew a thin packet. "The glass lantern. The Ashcroft. The Willoughby in Richmond. Should I continue, or does your client prefer to stipulate to motive contamination privately?" Vivian's head whipped toward Adrian. "Celine." Daniel made a sound somewhere between disgust and delight, like he'd briefly forgotten to be afraid and remembered he still enjoyed watching other people burn. My father looked at Adrian with a contempt so clean it might have been honest. "You stupid man." Third fracture. That was the moment the group stopped being a unit. Daniel blamed Adrian for the digital trail. Adrian blamed Daniel for sloppiness in operations. Gage blamed everyone with a college degree. Vivian hissed at my father that she had warned him about mixing family with business. One of the Richmond attorneys asked for a private caucus. Captain Mehta denied it. Malcolm requested devices. My father refused. Malcolm informed him refusal would be noted as obstruction posture pending warrant execution. Thomas Mercer, who had built an identity around men stepping back when he spoke, was being told no in his own language by people who did not need anything from him. And then Lena introduced the piece that made surrender inevitable. "Before we discuss resolution terms," she said, "there is one more matter. We have an internal witness whose documentary support resolves intent beyond speculative interpretation." My father frowned. "Who?" The side door opened. Maureen Delaney stepped in carrying 2 banker's boxes. My father's executive assistant for 18 years. Small frame. Silver hair in a neat twist. Navy cardigan over a colored blouse. Sensible shoes. The kind of woman men with expensive watches forget is in the room because she is always there and never centered. Which is precisely why she knew everything. Thomas Mercer actually stood up. "Maureen." She placed the boxes on the credenza with care. "Mr. Mercer." Vivian looked offended before she looked frightened, which told me a lot about her priorities. Maureen turned to Captain Mehta. "The first box contains copies of calendar entries, off-book meeting notes, and print instructions I was directed to destroy. The second contains correspondence logs and reimbursement records tied to Black Channel logistics. I retained them after I heard discussion of blaming Ms. Mercer and after learning one of the vessels serviced with the flagged components had reported a systems incident." Daniel stared. "You were in on this?" She faced him then, and there was something almost tender in how disappointed she looked. "No, Daniel. I was paying attention." Family betrayal story, revenge story, emotional justice, toxic family, narcissistic parents, family drama, humiliation, revenge, favoritism story, toxic father, golden child syndrome, public humiliation, karma story, emotional storytelling, family revenge, brother betrayal, father-daughter conflict, family business drama, fraud exposure story, emotional payoff, justice served story, toxic parents story, sister revenge story, manipulation exposed, corporate betrayal story, storytelling. Channel September Gala planning. She withdrew a yellow legal pad page written in my father's slanted handwriting. At the top, underlined twice, were the words, "Caroline narrative." Below it, bullet points, stress. Instability. Unauthorized copying. Protect company. Contain before Navy review. Daniel closed his eyes for half a second. Adrian looked like someone had struck the back of his knees. I didn't feel triumph then. Not in the cinematic sense. It wasn't hot. It wasn't wild. It was cool and clean and almost strangely quiet inside me. Like watching a bridge collapse after you've already driven off it. Captain Meta steepled his fingers. Here is where we are, he said. There is potential federal criminal exposure regarding false certifications, possible False Claims Act implications, document destruction concerns, obstruction issues, assault, retaliatory conduct against a reporting employee, and personal liability tied to fiduciary misrepresentation. We can proceed cooperatively today, or we can proceed compulsorily next week with less flexibility. No one interrupted him. He continued. Cooperation means immediate device surrender, resignation from all contract-facing roles, preservation compliance, access restoration to internal records, and execution of a civil transition agreement transferring emergency managerial authority away from implicated parties. It also means separate counsel for the marital matter and an acknowledgement of retaliatory conduct. Daniel looked at my father. Say something. Thomas Mercer sat down slowly. Leather creaked under him. For the first time in my life he looked old. Not weak. Just old. Like a man seeing the edge of his own relevance. He folded his hands on the walnut table and said to no one in particular, What do you want, Caroline? That question told me he still didn't understand. He still believed this was bargaining. That at the center of all this there must be an emotional demand. An inheritance. A title. An apology. Some daughter-shaped hole he could fill with the right concession. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I said, I want the truth documented. I want everyone who signed off on this removed from power. I want every sailor who touched your parts to matter more than your margin. And I want my name off the story you wrote for me. Lena slid the agreement packet toward the center of the table. Then sign. Adrian spoke first. Caroline, if you do this, there's no going back. I turned to him. There was no going back when you chose a strategy over a wife. He flinched. Daniel tried a different angle. You're destroying the company. No, I said. You did that when you started selling risk in patriotic packaging. Vivian's voice was thin now. Think about the family. I almost smiled. I am. Nora leaned back slightly in her chair, watching Daniel unravel with an expression I would later recognize as grief finally cleaned of illusion. My father stared at the agreement packet. His thumb rubbed once over the edge of the first page. A nervous habit from years ago, from kitchen table tax seasons and expansion loans in the early days when he had still built things instead of only defending them. Who told you first? He asked suddenly. He wasn't asking about the fraud. He was asking about the betrayal. Which leak? Which faithlessness had made his daughter dangerous? I answered honestly. You did. The moment you decided I was easier to sacrifice than listen to. Something in his face gave way then. Not remorse. Recognition. He signed. The pen looked small in his hand. Daniel refused for another 11 minutes. Then Malcolm mentioned phone extraction and conspiracy exposure in a tone so neutral it sounded inevitable. And Daniel signed too, slamming his initials down hard enough to indent the next 3 pages. Adrian asked for a private moment with me. Lena declined on my behalf. He signed the separation acknowledgement and interim asset order with trembling fingertips. His signature, usually elegant, broke in the middle of the P. Gage didn't sign anything with dramatic meaning because men like him are rarely central enough to their own destruction to deserve symbolism. His attorney accepted the assault referral and preservation directives, and Gage sat there sweating through his collar while the room moved on without needing his consent. When it was done, Captain Meta gathered the executed pages. Malcolm collected devices in evidence bags one by one. The little zipper seals sounded final. My father stood as I did. For a second we were facing each other at the long end of the walnut table with the harbor gray behind us and our reflections faint in the window glass. All those years of being his daughter. All those years of being trained to smooth, interpret, absorb, repair. All of it there between us like invisible furniture. He said, You could have come to me. I held his gaze. I did, I said. You sent Gage. Then I picked up my coat. As I passed Daniel, he muttered, You set us up. I paused just long enough to answer. No. I made sure you found exactly what you wanted to find. His eyes lifted to mine. Furious. Confused. smaller than I had ever seen them. Beside him, Nora was gathering her file. Daniel looked at her as if some part of him still expected rescue. She met his stare and said, "Next time make sure they're not working for both sides." I walked out before anyone could answer. The next few weeks were paperwork, interviews, affidavits, revisions, disclosures, and the kind of administrative violence that looks boring from the outside and feels seismic if your name is on the wrong line. Mercer Maritime Systems didn't collapse in one cinematic blast. Companies built on reputation rarely do. They come apart by memo, by withdrawal, by resignation letter, by a bank deciding it would rather not be mentioned in the same paragraph. My father stepped aside pending review. Then he resigned. Then the review became public enough that the pending part no longer mattered. Daniel tried to negotiate a carve-out for himself by implying he had only followed executive direction. Unfortunately for him, his own messages had a swaggering quality prosecutors tend to enjoy. People love to sound powerful in text. Later they are always surprised by how complete their own tone looks in print. Adrian moved out of our house on a Thursday while I was with Lena. He took suits, watches, framed degrees, and the espresso machine he claimed he'd bought before we married. He left the blue ceramic mug my mother had used when I was little. That felt accidental, which somehow made it more painful. Celine Ward resigned from the company 2 days after her name surfaced in the separation filings. I never spoke to her. She sent one message. "I didn't know he was helping them do that to you." I believed that she believed it. I still didn't answer. 3 months later, I signed the final papers on a new apartment in East Freemason. It was on the 6th floor of a converted warehouse with wide plank oak floors, steel-framed windows, and a balcony that caught the morning light over the Elizabeth River. The kitchen was smaller than the one Adrian and I had shared, but it belonged to me. White tile. Matte black fixtures. A narrow shelf where I lined up coffee jars and 2 small potted herbs I kept forgetting to water. On my first morning there, I stood barefoot on the cool floor with a heavy stoneware mug warming my hands while sunlight spread slowly across the countertop in pale gold rectangles. Fresh starts rarely feel triumphant at first. They feel quiet. The kettle clicks off. The city starts humming below. A gull lands on a railing somewhere. You realize no one in the room is lying to you because you are the only person there, and the piece of that hits like a second pulse. By then, the karmic inventory had become almost embarrassingly neat. My father lost his board seat at the Tidewater Naval Heritage Foundation within 2 weeks of the confrontation. The country club in Virginia Beach where he had spent 20 years mastering the art of generous visibility asked him to pause public representation, while matters were reviewed. 2 local business journals that used to quote him about leadership stopped returning his assistants' emails. The federal contracting bar notices didn't make front-page news, but in our part of the world they didn't need to. Doors close quietly when the right people read the right paragraph. Vivian suffered in the only arena she had ever taken seriously. Social standing. Invitations thinned. Lunches became vague. Women who used to lean in at galas and ask where she got her earrings now touched her elbow with pity and changed the subject. At a charity luncheon in November, someone seated her 3 tables back from the stage beside the widow of a retired harbor pilot she had once dismissed as regional. I heard that detail from Maureen, who delivered it over tea with a level of calm that made it feel like scripture. Daniel lost his title, his access, and eventually the illusion that charisma can substitute for records. He cooperated just enough to avoid the worst possible outcome and not enough to preserve his self-respect. His name became the kind that appears in procurement seminars as a cautionary bullet point. Men who used to clap him on the back at waterfront bars began suddenly noticing other people across the room. He tried consulting for 6 weeks. Apparently, former CEO under review does not convert as well as he'd hoped. Adrian's consequences were slower, which suited me. Fast collapses are dramatic. Slow diminishment is educational. The bar opened an ethics inquiry tied to document handling and retaliatory strategy. His boutique practice offers dried up. 1 partner left. Another began copying him on emails in the careful tone people use when they anticipate later distance. By January, he was subletting office space from a tax attorney in Chesapeake and sending messages at 11:42 p.m. that alternated between accusation, self-pity, and nostalgia. You made me the villain in a story that should have stayed between us. I miss who we were before all this. No one understands what your father put on me. I still know how you take your coffee. That one sat in my inbox for a week before I archived it. He wasn't wrong. He did know how I took my coffee. He had just never understood what I would no longer swallow with it. Gage pleaded down the assault charge and a witness intimidation count attached to Curtis Velez. Last I heard, he was doing private security for a chain of medical offices in Newport News and telling anyone who would listen that he'd been dragged into corporate drama. Men like Gage always reduce their choices to proximity, as if standing beside wrongdoing absolves participating in it. The messages from my family continued in waves. My father favored formality. You have made your point. This can still be repaired privately. The family isn't the same. That last one arrived 3 days before Christmas. No punctuation. No accusation. Just a fact-shaped lure tossed into the dark. Archived it too. Vivian's messages were photographs. Holiday table settings. An old silver menorah from my grandmother's house. The front hall done in winter greenery. Not apologies. Set design. Daniel texted only twice after his lawyer told him to stop. One said, "You always wanted to win." The other said, "I hope it was worth it." I never answered either. There is a kind of power in refusing to become the final editor of someone else's revisionist draft. Life didn't just empty out after the fire. It reorganized. Lena introduced me to 3 veteran-owned marine suppliers who needed compliance infrastructure strong enough to survive honest scrutiny. Then 5 more. Then a ship repair cooperative that wanted an independent ethics review before taking on federal work. What started as consulting became something larger. Mercer Integrity Advisory, which I named with the family surname on purpose and kept because I had finally decided I was done surrendering clean things just because dirty people had used them badly. We built processes. Audit ladders. Retaliation safeguards. Vendor verification systems. Anonymous reporting channels that actually worked. I hired 2 analysts, then 4. Curtis Velez came on as warehouse risk consultant after finishing his certification program. Maureen, after she retired, worked with us 2 days a week and reorganized our records room so efficiently it felt like being gently judged by architecture. People asked whether it was difficult starting over in the same city where everything had happened. It wasn't. Starting over somewhere else would have felt like exile. This felt like reclamation. Nora remained in my life in the most unexpected way. At first it was practical. A forwarded bulletin. A coffee after a hearing. A careful exchange of updates that began with logistics and ended with laughter. Then it became friendship, which I didn't see coming because I had spent months associating her name with Daniel's orbit. But there is something steadying about people who choose principle while it is still expensive. 6 months after the confrontation, she met me at a cafe in Ghent with black and white tiled floors and bentwood chairs polished smooth by decades of use. Morning light fell through the front windows and turned the sugar jars amber. She set her cup down, tucked one leg beneath her chair and said, "You won't believe who I just saw." "Daniel," I said. She smiled. "Adrian." I lifted an eyebrow. "At the airport," she said. Trying to impress a woman from 2 rows over in the lounge by telling her he was doing federal litigation strategy. Then he asked if military discounts applied to bourbon. I covered my mouth with my coffee cup to hide the laugh. Nora shook her head. "He still thinks Tone can save him." "Tone saved him for a long time," I said. "Not anymore." That was how karma updates often arrived. Not as thunder. As conversation. A sighting. A rumor confirmed by someone credible. The world has a way of passing around consequences quietly once powerful people stop being protected from ordinary observation. Another update came from Maureen in late spring while we were labeling archive boxes in our office storage room. "Thomas tried to join the board of a maritime museum in Portsmouth," she said, pressing a fresh label onto a file drawer. "They thanked him for his interest and selected someone less controversial." I slid a stack of vendor disclosures onto the shelf and said, "That must have stung." Maureen adjusted the alignment of the label by a millimeter. "Good." The apartment changed with the seasons. By summer, basil finally took on the balcony. By early fall, the river outside my windows reflected the sky in bruised violet at dusk, and I had developed the habit of sitting out there with my feet tucked under me and no phone in reach for at least 15 minutes each evening. Stability isn't glamorous when you're watching someone else's life online. In person, it's almost indecently luxurious. On a warm evening in October, Nora came over carrying a bottle of sparkling cider and a paper bag of takeout from the Lebanese place downstairs. The sunset had turned the buildings across the river copper and rose. City lights were just beginning to blink alive, one floor at a time, soft and patient. She stepped onto the balcony and handed me a plastic container. "They threw in extra garlic sauce because I think the owner likes you." "He likes prompt invoices," I said. "He definitely likes you." We ate at the little iron table near the railing while the sky deepened from orange to indigo. Boats moved below in slow shadow. Somewhere down the block, someone was practicing trumpet badly but earnestly. The air smelled like grilled bread, river wind, and the fading warmth of brick. At one point Nora leaned back, looking out over the water, and said, "Do you ever think about how close all of them came to getting away with it?" I considered that. Then I said, "No. I think about how certain they were that I would help them." He turned to me. "That still surprises me." "It doesn't surprise me," I said. "I was raised in a house where peace meant whoever had the least power absorbed the most damage." The city glowed below us, all glass and steel and sodium light. For a while we just listened to the evening settle. It struck me then how unlikely the moment was. 6 months earlier, Nora had still been sitting beside Daniel at charity tables, smiling for photographers, thinking she was dating ambition in a good suit. I had still been wearing a wedding ring and calling vigilance professionalism instead of survival. And now here we were on my balcony, passing warm pita back and forth and discussing regulatory reform and terrible men with the sort of ease that only exists after illusion burns off. Life is strange in that way. Sometimes the person who survives the same fire from the other side becomes the one who understands your scars best. When the food was gone, I brought out 2 stemless glasses and poured the cider. The liquid caught the last orange light and flashed gold between us. Nora lifted her glass. "To clean paperwork." I laughed and clinked mine against hers. "To women who read the footnotes." We drank. The first cool edge of evening brushed my arms. In the windows of the buildings across the river, sunset was breaking into fragments. I thought then about the woman I had been before all of this. Not a fool. I'm careful with that word. Women are too often called foolish when what they really were was generous inside systems designed to exploit generosity. I was competent, loyal, hardworking. I loved well. I believed that if I brought enough rigor and grace into a room, other people would eventually meet me there. They didn't. What changed was not that I became hard. It was that I became exact. I learned that composure is not the absence of feeling. It is feeling disciplined into direction. I learned that love without discernment can become unpaid labor for the dishonest. I learned that a calm woman with records is more dangerous than a screaming one without them. And I learned, perhaps most importantly, that justice rarely arrives looking like vindication in the moment. More often it looks like a signed page, a quiet room, a person in uniform saying your name when the people who tried to erase it are forced to listen. Later that night, after Nora left and the apartment had gone still again, I stood alone at the balcony rail with the empty glass in my hand and watched the city deepen into evening. The last band of sunlight rested low along the horizon, a warm orange seam fading behind the cranes and rooftops. Street lamps came on below. A train horn sounded somewhere distant and low. The river carried the lights in broken ribbons. There are versions of my father, my brother, my husband, and even myself that existed only because the truth had not yet been introduced properly. I don't hate them. That surprises people when they hear the story or the parts of it that travel. They expect hatred because it's easier to categorize than clarity. But hatred would mean I was still tethered to them, still arranging my interior life around the gravity of what they did. I'm not. If anything, in my quietest moments I feel something stranger and cleaner than forgiveness. Gratitude. Not for the humiliation. Not for the betrayal. Not for the burn of hot soup on my skin or the cold look on my father's face when he asked me to accept it for the sake of his image. I am grateful because they pushed every hidden weakness in me into the light where I could no longer afford to romanticize it. They cured me of pleading. They cured me of mistaking access for intimacy. They cured me of believing silence is noble when it only protects the cruel. And in doing that, they delivered me, unwillingly and permanently, to myself. A week after that evening, my father sent one final message. I never wanted this ending. I stood in my kitchen with morning sun on the counter and read it once. Then I placed the phone face down and poured coffee into my mug. Because that was the last thing he still didn't understand. This wasn't an ending. It was the first honest beginning I had ever been given. Sometimes the best revenge isn't about making people suffer. It's about building a life their damage can no longer reach. And if I've learned anything watching the sunset turn old glass into gold,